The CPKC holiday train is making stops in Chatham and Windsor tomorrow. Organizers say since it started in 1999, the holiday train has raised more than $26 million for local food banks.
Canada's rail network is quietly reshaping the balance of power in North American trade. A massive expansion of rail infrastructure is improving safety, boosting competition, and strengthening supply chain resilience, while opening new routes for Canadian grain exporters. As global trade becomes more uncertain and policy risks rise, Canadian producers are accelerating efforts to diversify their end markets. At the center of this shift is a single rail corridor that now links Canada directly to Mexico, dramatically reducing reliance on U.S. ports and American trade controls. Before going further, if you value clear, in-depth analysis of global trade and geopolitics, make sure to like this video and subscribe to stay informed. The transformation is being driven by Canadian Pacific Kansas City, the only single-line railroad that physically connects Canada, the United States, and Mexico under one integrated system. Spanning roughly 32,000 kilometers of track, this network allows grain harvested in the Canadian prairies to reach Mexican consumers without passing through U.S. export terminals, ports, or inspection bottlenecks. Canadian wheat can now move from Manitoba fields directly to bakeries in Mexico City with uninterrupted rail service, avoiding port congestion, political delays, and exposure to tariff threats. This development has major implications. For decades, Canadian grain exports to Latin America depended heavily on U.S. infrastructure. Rail lines fed into American ports, where U.S. companies handled inspections, shipping, and logistics. Every step generated American revenue and gave Washington leverage. That model is now being dismantled. Canadian grain is increasingly moving south by rail alone, cutting the United States out of a trade flow worth billions. The turning point came with the merger of Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern, a deal valued at approximately $31 billion. After years of regulatory review, the merger created the first truly continental railroad in North America. Competing bids failed, and the final agreement produced a seamless north-to-south rail system stretching from Canada's grain-producing regions to Mexico's largest consumption centers. Crucially, this network operates without the need for rail handoffs at borders, eliminating delays, added costs, and operational risk. Unlike traditional railroads that require transfers between multiple companies, this single-line structure means one operator, one schedule, and one set of standards. Grain loaded in Saskatchewan can arrive in central Mexico without changing railroads. That level of integration is rare and strategically valuable, particularly in an era of trade uncertainty. To capitalize on this advantage, CPKC committed more than 500 million Canadian dollars to expand grain capacity for upcoming crop years. Investments include thousands of new high-capacity hopper cars designed specifically for bulk grain, along with a fleet of modern, fuel-efficient locomotives built to handle longer, heavier trains. These upgrades are not incremental. They represent a structural expansion of Canada's ability to move agricultural products at scale. The numbers illustrate the impact. Annual Canadian grain volumes moved by rail are reaching levels not seen in years, with weekly capacity measured in the hundreds of thousands of metric tons. Even during periods when certain ports are seasonally unavailable, the rail network maintains enough throughput to sustain year-round exports. This is operational capacity, backed by physical assets, trained crews, and long-term planning. The symbolism of the new corridor is powerful. Canadian wheat, grown by Canadian farmers, transported in Canadian-built rail cars, reaches Mexican markets without touching U.S. export systems. The economic message is clear. Bilateral trade between Canada and Mexico can function independently of American infrastructure. Mexico's role in this shift is equally important. With a population exceeding 130 million and a rapidly expanding middle class, Mexico's demand for grain continues to rise. Domestic production is insufficient to meet consumption needs, making imports essential. While the United States has historically filled that role, trade unpredictability and tariff threats have pushed Mexican buyers to seek more stable partners. Canadian grain offers several advantages. High-protein wheat from the prairies is well suited for baking and food processing, meeting quality standards demanded by Mexican producers. At the same time, the new rail corridor simplifies logistics, shortens delivery timelines, and reduces exposure to policy disruptions. Digital certification systems further streamline customs clearance, making the Canada-Mexico grain trade more efficient than ever. As this corridor grows, the consequences for the United States become more pronounced. Pacific Northwest and Gulf Coast ports that once handled large volumes of Canadian grain are seeing traffic decline. Jobs, fees, and associated economic activity are gradually shifting away from American port cities. What was once a dependable revenue stream is being rerouted inland, directly to Mexico. Legally, the arrangement is solid. North American trade agreements allow for cross-border transit and rail shipments moving through U.S. territory without serving U.S. markets remain protected. Trains pass through the United States much like aircraft flying overhead, without engaging domestic infrastructure beyond basic transit. This limits Washington's ability to interfere and effectively removes a key source of leverage. The shift is being driven by more than politics. Exporters require predictability. Frequent policy changes, inconsistent border enforcement, inspection delays, and port congestion have made traditional routes risky. Canadian farmers and grain companies cannot afford uncertainty when dealing with perishable, time-sensitive commodities. The rail corridor to Mexico offers stability in an otherwise volatile environment. Once established, these trade patterns are difficult to reverse. Rail cars and locomotives are long-term assets, with lifespans measured in decades. Tracks laid today will shape trade flows for generations. Just as importantly, commercial relationships built between Canadian suppliers and Mexican buyers create lasting ties based on trust, quality, and reliability. Contracts evolve into partnerships, and partnerships mature into expectations that are not easily disrupted by short-term political shifts or diplomatic tension. Over time, labor, expertise, and capital align around the new route. Crews are trained specifically for the corridor. Maintenance hubs, storage facilities, and logistics centers emerge along the line. Software systems, customs processes, and scheduling practices are optimized for this flow of goods. Customers begin planning production cycles around the reliability of the rail link, embedding it into their long-term strategies. Even if political leadership changes, the economic logic remains. Infrastructure, once built, becomes reality on the ground. The broader implication is clear. Canada has reduced its dependence on U.S. trade infrastructure and strengthened its autonomy. Mexico has diversified its food supply and gained a reliable partner insulated from sudden policy shocks. The railroad itself has secured a strategic advantage, becoming an indispensable artery rather than a replaceable option. Meanwhile, American influence over this specific segment of North American trade has quietly diminished, not through confrontation, but through circumvention. What makes this shift especially significant is its subtlety. There is no dramatic announcement, no headline-grabbing rupture. Goods simply begin moving along a different path. Over time, volumes increase, efficiencies improve, and the alternative route becomes normal. Once that normalization occurs, Reversing it would require enormous financial investment and political coordination, both of which are far more difficult than maintaining the status quo. This corridor also sends a broader signal to global markets. It demonstrates that mid-sized powers can respond to uncertainty, not by escalating disputes, but by building options. Resilience, in this context, is not about isolation, but about choice. By creating parallel systems, countries reduce vulnerability and gain leverage without ever needing to use it explicitly. For the United States, the lesson is uncomfortable, but instructive. Influence derived from infrastructure is strongest when it is taken for granted. When partners begin planning around alternatives, that influence erodes quietly. Even if trade volumes remain high in absolute terms, relative importance shifts. Over time, policy tools that once carried weight begin to lose effectiveness. What began as a response to uncertainty has evolved into a permanent reconfiguration of continental logistics. The Canada-Mexico rail corridor now stands as a case study in how infrastructure investment can alter trade dynamics, neutralize political pressure, and reshape economic relationships. If you found this analysis valuable, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more in-depth coverage of the forces quietly transforming global trade.